Ars Notoria, Episode 5. Chapter 1. The Three Layers of Reality. The Surface of Reality. Most people believe they understand the world. They watch the news. They follow markets. They observe politics, technology, culture, and power. Events unfold in front of them, and the pattern seems simple. Something happens. People react. Consequences follow. A government passes a law. A company launches a breakthrough product. A financial system collapses. A leader suddenly appears and reshapes the direction of a nation. From the outside, reality appears to be nothing more than a chain of events. One event leads to another. A decision creates a reaction. A reaction produces a consequence. A consequence triggers the next event. And so most people learn to navigate life on this surface. They study what happened yesterday. They argue about what it means. They speculate about what might happen tomorrow. Entire industries are built around this habit. News networks analyze events. Markets react to events. Political debates revolve around events. The entire visible world seems to move from one event to the next. But this way of seeing reality contains a profound illusion, because events rarely begin where we think they do. They are usually the final moment of something much deeper. To understand this, imagine standing on the edge of the ocean during a storm. You see waves rising and crashing against the shoreline. Each wave appears dramatic and unpredictable. One moment the water is calm. The next moment a massive wall of water surges forward. From the shore it looks chaotic, but the waves are not the storm. They are only the visible surface of a much larger movement happening beneath the water. Deep below the surface, enormous currents shift across vast distances. Pressure changes slowly build. Energy travels through the ocean long before the wave ever appears. And by the time the wave reaches the shore, the movement that created it has already been unfolding for miles. Reality works in much the same way. The events that capture attention, the headlines, the crises, the dramatic decisions, are often the equivalent of waves. They are the surface. They are the moment when forces that were already moving finally become visible. Yet most attention never looks beneath that surface. People watch the waves. They celebrate them. They panic about them. They argue about who caused them. But very few ever look for the currents that produce them. This creates a strange imbalance in human perception. Almost all attention is focused on the most visible layer of reality, the event layer. But the deeper structure of the world operates somewhere else. And once someone begins to notice that difference, something remarkable happens. The world stops looking random. Patterns begin to appear. Connections emerge between events that once seemed unrelated. The surface starts revealing a deeper structure beneath it, a structure made of systems, a structure made of flows, a structure made of pressures shaping what eventually becomes visible. And somewhere inside that realization, a disturbing possibility appears. If events are only the surface, and systems shape the events, then perhaps the most important question is not what happened. Perhaps the real question is something far more unsettling. Who understands the system? And once that question appears, another one quietly follows behind it. Most people react to events. Some learn to understand systems. But the rarest minds operate reality itself. And the moment you understand that difference, the world stops looking the same. The hidden structure beneath events. Most people never move beyond the surface of reality. They live in the layer of events. A war begins. A market collapses. A law is passed. A leader rises. A reputation is destroyed. To the ordinary eye, these things look like causes, but they are usually effects. They are not the beginning of movement. They are the moment movement becomes visible. This is the first fracture in the common model of reality. Because once you understand that events are not primary, you are forced to ask a more dangerous question. What is primary? The answer is simple. Not easy, but simple. Reality is layered. The first layer is the layer of events. This is the world of headlines, decisions, public conflict, visible outcomes, and dramatic moments. It is the loudest layer. It is also the least intelligent layer. Beneath it is the second layer, the layer of systems. This is where patterns live, where incentives accumulate, where institutions stabilize behavior, where structures decide what is likely, what is rewarded, what is suppressed, and what eventually becomes inevitable. The event layer feels chaotic. The system layer is not chaotic. It is organized pressure. And beneath even that, there is a third layer, the layer almost no one sees clearly, the layer of operators. These are not always rulers, not always CEOs, not always public figures. Often they are the minds that understand how the system actually moves. They do not merely react to events. They do not merely analyze structures. They identify leverage points. They understand timing. They sense pressure before it surfaces. They move inside systems in ways that alter what eventually becomes visible. And this is the line that defines the episode. Most people react to events. Some learn to understand systems. But the rarest minds operate reality itself. That line is not mystical. It is structural. Because operating reality does not mean controlling the universe like a fantasy. It means understanding the hidden mechanics that produce visible outcomes. It means acting at the level where futures begin to take shape before they are announced to the world. This is why some people always seem late. They are reacting to what has already surfaced. And this is why some people seem almost unnaturally early. They are not seeing the same reality. They are seeing deeper into it. In the next sequence, we go further. Why are most minds trapped on the first layer? And what keeps human attention imprisoned at the level of events? The trap of attention. If the deeper layers of reality exist, why do so few people ever see them? Why do most minds remain fixed on the surface of events? The answer is not simply ignorance. It is attention. Human attention is a limited resource. At any given moment, the mind can only process a small portion of the information surrounding it. This limitation forces the brain to prioritize what appears urgent, visible, and emotionally stimulating. Events satisfy all three of those conditions. They are immediate, they are dramatic, and they often provoke strong emotional reactions. A sudden crisis attracts attention far more easily than a slow, structural shift. A dramatic speech captures more focus than a quiet change in incentives. A scandal spreads faster than a long-term transformation inside an institution. Because events trigger emotion, they dominate perception. But this dominance creates a distortion. When attention constantly gravitates toward events, the deeper forces shaping those events become invisible. People see the explosion. They rarely see the chain of pressure that built toward it. They see the market crash. They rarely see the structural incentives that made it inevitable. They see the decision. They rarely see the system that made the decision predictable. This distortion is reinforced by the environments in which people receive information. Modern information systems amplify events because events generate engagement. The faster and more dramatic the event, the more attention it attracts. This creates a feedback loop. Attention flows toward events. Information systems amplify events. Public conversation becomes centered on events. And slowly, the surface layer of reality becomes the only layer most people ever discuss. But this does not mean the deeper layers disappear. They simply continue operating without much observation. Systems evolve quietly. Power shifts gradually. Structural pressures accumulate. And by the time those pressures reach the surface as events, the direction of change is often already determined. This creates a peculiar asymmetry in human awareness. The majority of people experience reality only at the moment it becomes visible. But the individuals who understand systems experience reality earlier. They notice shifts long before they produce dramatic outcomes. They observe changes in incentives. They watch flows of information. They track subtle movements inside institutions, markets, and networks. What appears sudden to the public often looks predictable to them. Because they are not watching the waves, they are watching the currents beneath them. This difference in perception creates two completely different relationships with reality. One group reacts to events after they occur. The other group anticipates events before they appear. The first group experiences the world as unpredictable. The second experiences it as structured. And this difference slowly separates observers from operators. Because once someone learns to see systems clearly, events lose much of their mystery. They become the visible endpoint of movements that were already underway. The future stops looking like chaos. It begins to look like a field of emerging patterns, and the mind observing those patterns gains a new kind of freedom. The freedom not just to react to what happens, but to understand where movement is heading long before it arrives. The first glimpse of the operator. Once a person begins to see the difference between events and systems, a subtle shift takes place. At first, the change feels small. The observer simply notices patterns that were previously invisible. Connections begin to appear between decisions, incentives, institutions, and outcomes. What once looked random starts to feel structured. But this is only the beginning. Because understanding systems does not automatically mean operating them. Many intelligent people reach the second layer of reality. They become analysts of systems. They can explain why a market moves the way it does. They can predict how institutions will behave. They can map the incentives shaping political or economic outcomes. This level of perception is already far beyond the event layer, but it still remains observational. It is the difference between understanding a machine and controlling it. At this stage, the observer can see patterns unfolding across time. They recognize recurring structures. Cycles become visible. Pressure builds in predictable ways. A financial bubble expands slowly before it bursts. A technological shift destabilizes entire industries. An institutional imbalance accumulates tension before a crisis appears. To the observer, these developments no longer feel sudden. They appear as the final stage of movements that began long before. This creates a sense of foresight. The observer can anticipate certain outcomes. They can prepare. They can position themselves slightly ahead of visible change. But something even more profound begins to emerge for a very small number of minds. They start asking a different question. Not simply, what is the system doing? But rather, where inside this system does influence actually concentrate? Every complex system contains points where pressure accumulates. Small adjustments at those points can create disproportionately large consequences. In engineering, these are leverage points. In biology, they appear as regulatory mechanisms. In economics, they appear as incentive structures. And in social systems, they appear as decision bottlenecks. Once a mind begins to notice these leverage points, the system stops looking like a massive, uncontrollable structure. It begins to resemble a network of pathways. Some pathways are resistant, others are fluid. Some points are stable, others are extremely sensitive to small changes. This is the moment when observation begins transforming into operation. Because the observer is no longer merely watching the system, they are identifying where movement can be redirected. At this stage, the system reveals an entirely different dimension. Instead of appearing like a rigid machine, it begins to resemble a landscape filled with currents, slopes, and pressure gradients. Movement becomes possible not through brute force, but through alignment with those currents. This is why operators rarely appear dramatic. They do not constantly fight structures. They understand where structures are already shifting, and they act at the moment when a small movement produces a cascading effect. To an outside observer, this behavior often appears mysterious. A decision made quietly today produces massive consequences months later. A subtle shift in position changes the trajectory of an entire organization. An idea introduced at the right moment reshapes a field of activity. The public sees the event when it finally appears, but the operator saw the system long before the event existed. And this difference between reacting to events, understanding systems, and identifying leverage within them marks the beginning of a new level of perception, one where the world is no longer a sequence of surprises, but a structure that can be read, and sometimes carefully moved. The geometry of leverage. When someone first begins to study systems, they often imagine them as massive structures, rigid, complicated, almost immovable. Large institutions appear permanent, economic systems seem overwhelming, political structures feel too powerful to influence. From the outside, these systems resemble enormous machines that move only through enormous effort. But this perception is misleading. Because complex systems rarely behave like rigid machines, they behave more like dynamic landscapes. Within every system, there are regions of stability and regions of sensitivity. Some areas resist change with extraordinary force. Other areas respond dramatically to even the smallest input. The difference between these regions is rarely obvious from the surface. In fact, the most powerful leverage points in a system are often invisible to those focused on events. They exist within structures, inside incentive patterns, within the architecture of decision-making itself. To understand this, consider a simple mechanical example. A massive door may appear impossible to move. Push at the wrong point, and it will barely shift. But apply force at the hinge in exactly the right direction, and the same door can swing open with minimal effort. The system did not change. The position of the force did. This same principle appears everywhere. In economics, a small regulatory shift can redirect entire markets. In technology, a minor change in architecture can reshape entire industries. In social networks, a single influential node can alter the flow of information across millions of people. The scale of the outcome is rarely proportional to the size of the action. Instead, the outcome is determined by where the action occurs inside the system. This is the beginning of what operators understand intuitively. Effort is not the primary driver of change. Position is. A poorly positioned effort can produce almost nothing. A precisely positioned action can transform the trajectory of an entire structure. But identifying these positions requires a completely different way of observing reality. It requires attention to patterns rather than events, to incentives rather than announcements, to structures rather than headlines. The operator learns to watch the slow movements beneath visible change, pressure accumulating inside an institution, a shift in incentives within a market, an emerging network forming around a new idea. These subtle shifts often appear insignificant at first, but within them lies the early formation of leverage. Because systems tend to concentrate influence at specific junctions, points where flows intersect, where decisions accumulate, where information converges. These junctions act like control points inside a complex machine. Change them slightly, and the entire system begins adjusting around the new configuration. To those watching only the surface, the resulting event appears sudden, unexpected, even mysterious. But to the operator, the movement was already visible long before the event emerged. They saw the pressure building. They saw the leverage forming. They saw the direction in which the system was preparing to move. And when the moment arrived, they did not need to force change. They simply acted where the system was already most sensitive. This is why operators rarely rely on brute force. They rely on precision. The difference between these two approaches defines two completely different relationships with power. The reactive mind pushes against structures. The strategic mind studies them. But the operator identifies the exact point where a small movement changes everything. And once someone begins to see leverage this way, the world no longer appears overwhelming. It begins to resemble a network of possibilities, a system that can be read, and occasionally, quietly redirected. When systems resist. Every complex system has one defining characteristic. It resists sudden change. This resistance is not accidental. It is a survival mechanism. Systems exist to stabilize behavior across time. Institutions, markets, organizations, and even cultural structures evolve in ways that protect their internal balance. Once a system reaches equilibrium, it begins defending that equilibrium almost automatically. This is why meaningful change inside large systems rarely happens through direct confrontation. The system reacts. It slows decisions. It redirects pressure. It absorbs disruption. Sometimes it even appears to accept change temporarily, only to restore the original balance later. From the perspective of someone focused only on events, this behavior can feel confusing. A reform is announced, a policy is implemented, a bold initiative is launched, and yet months later, the system looks strangely similar to how it did before. The visible action happened, but the deeper structure remained intact. This phenomenon appears everywhere. Corporations announce strategic transformations that never fully materialize. Governments introduce sweeping reforms that fade over time. Entire industries promise disruption, yet quietly return to familiar patterns. Observers watching the event layer often interpret these outcomes as incompetence or bad execution. But the deeper explanation is structural. Systems resist because their internal networks are designed to preserve stability. Every system contains multiple reinforcing mechanisms. Incentives align behavior. Rules regulate movement. Cultural expectations stabilize decisions. Information flows through established pathways. All of these elements combine to create a powerful inertia. Even individuals within the system may sincerely want change. But the structure itself subtly redirects behavior back toward equilibrium. Understanding this resistance is one of the most important steps toward becoming an operator, because it changes how influence is applied. The reactive mind attempts to push against the system. It confronts the structure directly. It applies force at the visible surface. And when the system pushes back, the reaction is usually to push harder. But this approach almost always strengthens the system's defensive response. Pressure produces counterpressure. Conflict produces consolidation. Resistance grows. The operator recognizes a different pattern. Instead of confronting the system where it is strongest, they study how the system maintains its balance. They observe which forces stabilize the structure, which incentives reinforce behavior, which flows of information guide decisions. And gradually a different map emerges. The system begins to resemble a field of pressures rather than a fixed structure. Some pressures oppose movement, others quietly enable it. The art of operation lies in recognizing where the system's own dynamics can be used to produce change. Instead of fighting resistance, the operator aligns with forces that are already shifting. They introduce movement where pressure is building. They act at the moment when equilibrium becomes unstable. From the outside, this behavior often appears effortless. Observers may attribute the outcome to luck, timing, or intuition. But the reality is more precise. The operator did not force the system to move. They acted at the moment when the system was already preparing to move. And by doing so, a very small action can produce a disproportionately large effect. This is why genuine influence often appears subtle. The most powerful actions rarely look dramatic at the moment they occur. They look ordinary, almost invisible. Only later, when the consequences unfold across the system, does their significance become clear. At that point, the visible event finally appears. But by then, the deeper movement has already taken place. Moving inside pressure fields. Once someone understands that systems resist sudden force, a new way of seeing the world begins to emerge. The system stops appearing like a rigid structure. Instead, it begins to resemble a field of pressures. Within that field, different forces constantly interact. Incentives pull behavior in one direction. Institutional rules pull it in another. Cultural expectations stabilize certain patterns while discouraging others. Information flows through networks that subtly guide decisions long before they are publicly visible. These pressures rarely move in straight lines. They circulate, they accumulate, they reinforce one another in ways that are difficult to notice from the surface. To someone focused on events, the system appears unpredictable. Decisions feel arbitrary. Outcomes seem to arrive suddenly, without warning. But when attention shifts toward the deeper layer of systems, a different picture begins to form. Movement is no longer random. It follows gradients. Much like water flowing downhill, pressure inside systems seeks paths of least resistance. Policies move where institutional alignment exists. Markets shift where incentives quietly converge. Ideas spread where networks are already prepared to receive them. The system is not chaotic. It is directional. But its direction is often invisible until someone begins observing the pressure itself. This is where the operator's perception becomes fundamentally different from that of the observer. The observer studies the structure. The operator studies the flow. They watch where tension is accumulating. They observe which forces are reinforcing each other. They notice when previously stable patterns begin to weaken. Most importantly, they learn to recognize the moments when equilibrium becomes fragile. Every system contains periods of stability. For long stretches of time, the structure appears solid. Institutions behave predictably. Markets follow familiar rhythms. Organizations repeat established patterns. But stability is never permanent. Pressure slowly builds inside every system. Incentives change. Technologies emerge. Networks reorganize. And at certain moments, the accumulated tension becomes too great for the existing equilibrium to hold. This is when the system becomes sensitive. Very small inputs can suddenly produce large consequences. A minor decision redirects a market. A quiet internal shift destabilizes an institution. A subtle change in incentives reshapes behavior across an entire network. To those watching only the surface, these moments look like sudden disruption. But the operator sees something else entirely. They recognize a pressure threshold. They know that once the system approaches this threshold, the structure becomes temporarily flexible. What was impossible yesterday becomes possible today. Movement that would have been resisted now begins to propagate through the system. This is the moment where the operator acts. Not before, not after, but precisely when pressure and opportunity intersect. Their intervention does not appear dramatic. It often looks almost insignificant. But because the system itself is already shifting, the effect multiplies. One small movement travels along pathways already under tension. And what began as a subtle adjustment spreads outward through the structure. From the outside, the resulting change may look like a sudden transformation. But the operator understands that the transformation began long before the event appeared. They simply acted at the moment when the system was ready to move. This is the quiet art of operating reality. Not forcing the system, not fighting its resistance, but understanding the invisible pressures that shape its motion, and stepping into that motion at exactly the right moment. The invisible moment. There is a strange property shared by many of the most important moments in history. Most people never see them when they happen. They see the consequences. They see the headlines. They see the dramatic event that suddenly changes the landscape. But the moment where the direction actually shifted often passed quietly, unnoticed by almost everyone. This is one of the deepest illusions created by the event layer of reality. Events appear to be the beginning of change. In truth, they are usually the final confirmation that change has already occurred. By the time a new technology disrupts an industry, the forces that made the disruption inevitable have already been building for years. By the time a political transformation shocks the public, the structural pressures that produced it have already been accumulating beneath the surface. By the time a market collapses, the system has already been unstable long before the crash becomes visible. This delay between cause and visibility creates a profound misunderstanding about where influence actually happens. People believe the decisive moment occurs when the event appears. But the real moment of influence often occurred long before anyone was paying attention. In that earlier phase, the system was still fluid. Possibilities were still open. The direction of movement had not yet hardened into inevitability. Once the event layer activates, much of the outcome is already locked in place. At that stage, the system is no longer flexible. It is merely revealing the consequences of earlier structural movements. Operators understand this timing difference. They know that the most important moment inside any system rarely coincides with the moment the world begins watching. The most important moment is earlier, often much earlier. It is the quiet period when pressure is still forming, when patterns are beginning to align, when leverage is emerging but not yet visible. During that period, the system still contains multiple possible futures. Small actions can still redirect movement. Structures can still shift. Networks can still reorganize. Once the system crosses a certain threshold, those possibilities begin to collapse. The direction becomes increasingly fixed. The system moves toward the outcome that the deeper pressures have already prepared. At that stage, observers finally notice something happening. But the operator has already moved. This is why operators often appear strangely absent from the visible drama of events. They are rarely the loudest voice during the moment of crisis. They are rarely the most visible actor during the public phase of change. Their influence occurred earlier, in the invisible moment when the system was still deciding which future to become. By the time the public sees the event, the operator is no longer shaping the possibility. They are watching the consequence unfold. To someone living inside the event layer, this timing difference is almost impossible to see. It feels as though certain individuals possess extraordinary intuition or luck. They always seem to act just before something major happens. They seem to position themselves in the right place at the right time. But what appears as intuition is often something much simpler. They were observing the system earlier than everyone else. They were watching the pressure long before the wave appeared. And when the invisible moment arrived, they moved. The hidden hands of structure. Once someone begins to recognize the invisible moment where systems change direction, another realization gradually emerges. The individuals who shape those moments are rarely the same individuals who appear at the center of the visible story. Public narratives usually focus on the figures who stand on the stage of events: presidents, CEOs, celebrities, public intellectuals. These figures occupy the visible layer of reality. They give speeches. They sign decisions. They appear in headlines. To most observers, they look like the primary drivers of change. But in complex systems, the most visible actors are often operating within structures that were already shaped before they arrived. By the time a leader announces a policy, the institutional dynamics behind that decision have often been developing for years. By the time a company introduces a revolutionary product, entire technological ecosystems have already shifted to make that product possible. By the time a public movement erupts, networks of communication and shared incentives have already prepared the ground for its emergence. The visible actors are part of the story, but they are rarely the entire mechanism. Behind every visible event lies a deeper architecture of influence. Networks of expertise, flows of capital, structures of incentives, long chains of decisions distributed across institutions and organizations. These elements quietly shape the direction in which events become possible. And within those structures, certain individuals learn to operate with remarkable subtlety. They rarely appear in headlines. They rarely seek attention. Their influence does not rely on dramatic gestures. Instead, they work inside the structural layer of reality. They adjust incentives. They build networks. They redirect flows of information. They position ideas where they will propagate most effectively. None of these actions appear dramatic in isolation. Each step looks small, But over time, the structure of the system begins to change. And when the moment of visible transformation finally arrives, the world interprets the event as sudden, unexpected, even shocking. But the operator understands something different. The event was not the cause, it was the confirmation. The public narrative focuses on the moment when change becomes visible. The operator focuses on the long period before that moment, the quiet period where structures were slowly rearranged, where leverage accumulated, where networks formed, where incentives shifted. During that period, the visible story had not yet begun, but the direction of the future was already being shaped. This is why influence inside complex systems rarely looks dramatic. The most powerful changes often occur without spectacle, without announcement, without public recognition. And when the resulting event finally appears on the surface, the individuals responsible for shaping the deeper movement may remain almost completely invisible. From the perspective of the event layer, this invisibility creates confusion. Observers search for obvious causes. They attribute outcomes to personalities, accidents, or sudden decisions. But the operator sees a different picture. A long sequence of structural adjustments, each one small, each one quiet, each one pushing the system slightly closer to a new configuration, until eventually the visible world catches up with what was already happening beneath it. Position defines power. At this point, a deeper pattern begins to emerge. Events alone cannot explain reality. Systems determine how events unfold. Pressure accumulates inside those systems long before change becomes visible. Leverage exists at specific points where small movements can redirect enormous structures. Operators act during the quiet moments when pressure and leverage intersect. But one final element determines whether influence is possible. Position. Inside any complex system, position determines the scale of impact. Two individuals may perform the same action, the same idea, the same decision, the same effort. Yet the consequences can be completely different. One action disappears without effect. The other ripples outward across the entire system. The difference is rarely intelligence, and it is rarely effort. The difference is position. In complex structures, certain locations concentrate influence, where information converges, where decisions are filtered, where incentives are shaped, where networks intersect. From these locations, even a small action can travel across the system like a signal through a network. Outside these locations, enormous effort may produce almost nothing. This is one of the least understood dynamics of power. Most people assume influence grows proportionally with effort. They believe the person who works harder, pushes louder, or fights longer will eventually move the system. But complex systems do not respond primarily to effort. They respond to structural position. Imagine a vast electrical grid. Millions of wires stretch across enormous distances. Energy flows through the network continuously. A small switch located at a central junction can redirect energy across an entire region. Yet the same switch placed somewhere along a minor branch of the grid would have almost no impact. The power of the switch is not determined by its size. It is determined by its location within the network. Human systems function in much the same way. Institutions, markets, organizations, and communication networks all contain structural junctions where influence concentrates. Some positions allow a person to observe flows of information before others see them. Some positions connect multiple decision points. Some positions sit directly on the pathways through which pressure moves. When someone occupies one of these positions, the system becomes far more responsive to their actions. A small adjustment travels far. A small signal propagates widely. The operator understands this principle instinctively. They do not attempt to control every element of the system. They look for the places where the system already concentrates influence. They study the architecture of connections. They observe where information flows converge. They notice where decisions must pass before becoming reality. and gradually, they position themselves where those flows intersect. Once that position is secured, influence becomes easier, because the system itself carries the signal. From the outside, it may appear as though the operator possesses extraordinary authority, but the real source of their effectiveness lies somewhere deeper. They are standing in the right place inside the system. And once someone learns to see systems in this way, the idea of power begins to change. It is no longer about pushing harder. It becomes about standing where movement already passes. The quiet nature of power. At first glance, power appears loud. It announces itself. It dominates conversations. It commands attention. From the perspective of the event layer, powerful individuals seem easy to identify. They speak publicly. They issue directives. They stand at the center of visible decisions. Their actions are recorded, discussed, and analyzed. But when one begins studying systems rather than events, the appearance of power begins to change. Many individuals who appear powerful are actually responding to pressures already embedded within the system. Their choices are shaped by incentives they did not create. Their options are limited by structures that existed before they arrived. Their decisions are constrained by networks of influence that surround them. They occupy visible positions, but visibility is not the same as control. In contrast, those who understand systems often operate in ways that appear surprisingly quiet. They rarely attempt to dominate the event layer. They rarely rely on spectacle. Instead, they focus on the deeper architecture through which influence travels. They study flows. They observe incentives. They analyze the structure of networks that carry information and decisions through the system. Once those structures become visible, the path of influence changes. Rather than pushing directly against visible authority, the operator begins adjusting the architecture beneath it. They shape incentives that guide future decisions. They redirect information flows that influence perception. They build networks that allow ideas to propagate across institutions. None of these actions appear dramatic when viewed individually. They look technical, procedural, sometimes even invisible. Yet over time, these adjustments reshape the environment in which visible decisions occur. And once the environment changes, the outcomes begin to change as well. Observers often attribute these outcomes to leadership, to personalities, to bold decisions made at the top. But the operator recognizes that the deeper transformation occurred earlier. It occurred when the structure guiding those decisions was quietly redesigned. This is why genuine influence inside complex systems rarely resembles the dramatic forms of power portrayed in public narratives. It does not rely on spectacle. It relies on structure. It does not dominate the moment. It shapes the environment in which the moment eventually occurs. From the outside, this quiet approach can appear unimpressive. The operator does not look like a conqueror. They do not resemble the archetype of visible authority. But within the architecture of the system, their actions travel far. Small adjustments cascade through networks of incentives and information. Signals propagate across institutions. Gradually, the system begins moving in a new direction. And by the time the visible world begins to notice the change, the deeper movement is already complete. This is the quiet nature of power inside complex systems. Not force, not spectacle, but structural influence applied long before the event becomes visible. Seeing the architecture. At the beginning of this chapter, the world looked familiar. Events seemed to define reality. Decisions appeared to emerge suddenly. Power looked visible, dramatic, and immediate. But now, something subtle has changed. The surface of events no longer appears solid. It begins to look more like a reflection, a visible layer floating above deeper movements. Behind every event lies a structure. Behind every structure lies a pattern of pressure. And within that pattern, certain points hold disproportionate influence. These points are rarely obvious. They are not labeled. They do not announce themselves. Yet they shape the direction in which systems evolve. When someone first recognizes this architecture, The experience can feel disorienting. The world that once appeared chaotic begins revealing hidden order. Events that seem sudden begin to show long structural preparation. Outcomes that once looked accidental reveal chains of incentives and pressures guiding them. The illusion slowly dissolves. Reality becomes layered. The event layer still exists. News still unfolds. Decisions still appear in public view. But those events are no longer interpreted as the beginning of change. They are understood as the final stage of movements that began much earlier. Once this perception stabilizes, a new question naturally emerges. If events are only the surface, if systems shape the direction beneath them, then what determines the behavior of those systems themselves? What causes them to stabilize? What causes them to resist change? And what causes them to suddenly shift direction after years of apparent stability? These questions lead deeper into the architecture of reality. Because systems are not random, they follow patterns. They evolve according to structures that can be studied, mapped, and sometimes redirected. But doing so requires a different relationship with observation. It requires learning to read pressure before it becomes visible, to recognize leverage before it becomes obvious, to understand position before influence is required. This is where the perspective of the operator begins to take shape. Not as someone who dominates events, but as someone who understands how events emerge from deeper structures. At that point, the world begins to look very different. Headlines lose their hypnotic urgency. Public drama becomes easier to interpret. Large changes become predictable long before they occur. And gradually, a deeper realization forms. Most people react to events. Some learn to understand systems. But the rarest minds operate reality itself. This is the threshold where observation becomes architecture. And in the next chapter, we move further into the hidden mechanisms that shape the behavior of complex systems. Because once someone sees the architecture, the next step is learning how to navigate inside it.